Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Argo Visa's webinar today. We are very, very excited to be joined by Mr. Leon Rodriguez, who is the former USCIS director. For those of you who joined us yesterday for our webinar, thank you so much for joining. We'd love for you to comment down below with a little bit more of maybe where you're joining us from, or if you have a student visa interview coming up. Let us know when that is or where you're applying. So with that, I would love for our guest here to introduce himself and why he's here to talk with us today.
Hello, everybody. This is Leon Rodriguez. I'm a partner in the immigration group at Seyfarth Shaw, and where I'm also the chair of our firm's government relations group. I joined the firm about 8 years ago, and before that, I had served as director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And if you're on this call, it probably means you know exactly what that is and what those folks do. The other thing I'd like to share is just a little bit about my personal background. My parents came here from Cuba in the early 1960s. They came in 1961. I was born in 1962. They actually had been students in Cuba and actually had to discontinue their studies when they first came to the United States in order to work. I just wanted to share that my family's journey is probably somewhat like that of many of you who are tuning into this call. And with that, let's talk about F-1 visas.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing and for opening up about your personal background as well. I think, yeah, students will resonate with hearing about that and about your experience now, as well as your prior experience. So as you guys all know, throughout this week, we're doing extra content talking all about student visa applications. Even in our webinar yesterday, we had some questions about the current events that some people are reading about in the news with F-1 visas, whether it be what's happening with some terminations, but also people just wondering, okay, what is going to be the impact of student visas with this new administration? So there are many people kind of speculating. Some things being shared are accurate facts, but there's also a lot of myths and rumors circulating around. So we're really happy to have a true expert that we can trust here to talk about this. So could you give us a bit of a recap of what changes there have been for F-1 visa holders in the recent weeks and months of the new administration?
Probably everybody has been paying attention to what's been a notable number of SCIS terminations. And just as a reminder to everybody, I'm not sure how far away you are from your undergraduate time, SCIS is the Student Exchange Visitor Information System. It is something that is directly tied to your being on the record in that system, is directly tied to your ability to work and study in the United States. And the other thing to understand about a SCIS termination, if somebody is essentially removed from the SCIS system, is that is different than a visa termination. A visa is your travel document. That is what permits you to enter, to board a plane overseas and to enter the United States. You can have one without the other. So you can have your visa termination and your SCIS visa revocation and your SCIS record be just fine, and you can continue to study or work as the case might be. And vice versa, you can have a termination of your SCIS record that won't necessarily mean that your visa has been terminated, although it probably will mean that in the end. So the latest, as probably everybody knows, this is something that always happens. Doesn't matter who's president, doesn't matter who's in charge of DHS. There are always SCIS terminations. There are things, though, that are different about the last, the ones we've been hearing about in particular in the last couple of months, and it is something to pay attention to. It's also important, though, to have it in perspective. A significant number of schools have had terminations in their SEVIS records, of their SEVIS records, but the number is something like 1,000, a little bit over 1,000 as of now. And that needs to be benchmarked against the overall F-1 population in the US, which is well over 1 million these days. Actually, Davis, I think you were noting the very helpful statistic that there are 300,000 visa entries into the U.S. every year in the F-1 category.
Yeah.
And so if you add that up to what that means about who's actually in the U.S. in F-1 status, it's not surprising that there's well over 1 million people in the U.S. in that status. Those SEVIS terminations have come in two categories, and they're categories that you really would not hear about in the volume that you would have heard about them in prior times. So there's really two. The first is the message on the SEVIS termination is that a criminal background check is the basis. In other words, it doesn't say what's in the criminal background check. It doesn't say whether you're even charged with a crime. It just says that a criminal background check is the basis for a determination that the F-1 visa holder has failed to maintain status in the U.S. What we have been hearing and learning about those is that those could be people who, for example, were charged with a very, very minor offense and never actually convicted of it, never actually found guilty of it. It could even be, in some instances, people who were merely investigated for particular criminal conduct, but it could also be more serious offenses. The other categories, and that I would say from everything that I've been sort of getting called about here, is the main categories are really, that's probably the bigger volume of these terminations is on that basis. Then there's a relatively smaller number that is in a category, in one of two categories. One is serious adverse foreign policy consequences. The other is national security or foreign policy concerns. And these seem, for the most part, to be connected to the campus protests related to the Israel-Palestine conflict that occurred and or have been occurring over the last now probably about 20 months, 20 months. And again, that's relatively small. It's been very high profile because some of a very, very small number of those have actually resulted in detentions of individuals, not necessarily in F-1 status. In fact, there have been people even with green cards who have been detained under that category. So that is that is significant.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens and what's supposed to happen when one of those two events occurs? One, it's possible that the criminal history has nothing to do with you. It's actually not your criminal history if this happens to you. And so it's very important when this happens to contact counsel and to see if there is some way of effectively challenging the termination in the SEVIS record. And there have, in fact, been many, many lawsuits. And in fact, there's a class action, actually, that people are joining today. I think today's the deadline to join the class action that is basically challenging the overall process, because people a lot of times have no idea, in fact, why their visas being revoked. But it is important to check with counsel to see if there's anything that can be done. And it's important to do it quickly because the expectation is if your visa is revoked, your SEVIS record is terminated, that amounts to a termination of your status as an F-1 student, you're basically expected to depart the United States. So unless you're actively in the process of challenging the SEVIS termination, the best advice is actually to leave. The other thing that you can do working with counsel is to seek reinstatement of your SEVIS record and of your F-1 status. And even if you have had criminal history involvement, it is possible to do that because you can show all the reasons why, sort of looking at your overall circumstances, why, in fact, you should still be able to allow to stay in the United States. And as the case might be, continue studying or continue working. I think also important to point out, this has been a result of what we in the business call scrapes of the criminal history data. So they're looking in computer systems, and they're not the people who are making these decisions don't necessarily know the full story about the individuals involved and whose records are being terminated in the system. So it really underscores the importance of being able to present data to respond. And this is something that is affecting enrolled students, but it's also affecting people in their OPT period. And so it could also have a direct consequence for people who are employed under their OPT. That raises another issue for them, and of course for their employers, again, that really merits immediate response on their part. That's what's now.
Yeah, that's an incredibly helpful breakdown, just going through, okay, what are the causes, what's happening, what are the consequences? So just to summarize, what you were saying. So SEVIS terminations, you're saying, have happened before in previous administrations, but right now it seems to be there's an increase and maybe some more scrutiny. Is that what you would say, or?
Yeah, well, there's a specific, this is not scrutiny that, as far as I know, existed before the last couple of months. Meaning, there were always SEVIS terminations for failure to pay fees because of serious criminal convictions, failure to maintain enrollment because of persistent violations of your work hours while you were enrolled. I mean, these are categories that were reasons why people would have their F-1 terminated, and that again, it didn't matter who was president; those things were happening. Those things have always been happening. These two, where suddenly you're hearing about people who were just charged with a crime, being terminated well after the event occurred, or people who were involved in protests. That's really something new in this particular period.
Got it. And what's all included in criminal background? Because I've heard some stories of maybe people saying they had reckless driving or other things like that. What kind of would fall under that criminal background category?
It's a pretty broad category of things, and some of which are so minor and so trivial that in fact, if you got it in front of an immigration officer who was paying attention, they may well say, actually that was a mistake. We shouldn't have terminated. And again, that points to the importance of responding quickly and with help of counsel if this happens to you. But it does seem to be involving pretty minor offenses, and part of that is logical, because if it was a more major offense and the F-1 was convicted, then this would have happened a long time ago.
Yeah. Okay.
This is because they're now going back and they're sort of looking for people. And that's why you're hearing about these relatively minor offenses that are happening.
Okay, that makes sense. And I think, just to emphasize a point you said, is if this is you or if this has happened to you, to seek counsel, find an immigration attorney as quickly as possible to help you move forward. So, you kind of said, okay, they did a scrape, there's an increase right now. Is this something we should expect to continue seeing? I mean, what do you think is next for student visa holders that they should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think the main thing is, I think I'm also looking back sort of the experience of the first Trump administration, where sort of there was a lot more compliance focus with respect to all visa categories, not just the F-1 category, but all visa categories. And so I think the main thing to be thinking about is just being careful about your requirements. So if there are fees that need to be paid, you should pay your fees. If you're enrolled as a student and you have limits on how much you're allowed to work, you should be very conscious of staying within those limits and avoiding violations of those limits. If you go overseas, if you go home, there's a 5-month limit to how long you can be away. So even if you're going home for summer vacation or something like that, you should be mindful of those limits. And if you do have criminal justice involvement, that is something that pretty much when it happens, you want to have immigration counsel involved with you in making decisions about how to manage that situation, so that it doesn't, every effort is made to avoid it escalating into one of these issues that we're hearing about right now. But I do think we are going to keep hearing about revocations. I think I think the biggest bulk of it has probably already happened, because I think they've searched through their systems to find people. They found whatever sort of sitting there that fits within the categories that have interested them, and so I think this might settle down a little bit for that reason.
Well, that's encouraging, and I think another thing that you brought up, which makes sense, is just the compliance piece and really paying attention to those elements for students here. One quick note just for everybody who's here and joining us: if you do have questions, feel free to write them in the chat. If your questions are more about the visa interview itself, we'll be covering those more in our other sessions throughout the week. So otherwise, we will be here to answer your questions at the end. So that makes sense. There's probably not too many things for students to be actively anxious about, I guess. Would you say that, what would you recommend to students that are navigating or considering applying for an F-1? At Argo, we work with a lot of students. They're about to apply for their F-1, but we're getting questions of concern about what's happening in the U.S. right now. Do you think this should deter them? What are your thoughts on, what would you recommend to students about to come to the U.S.?
Yeah, I think the main thing is to keep this particular trend in perspective, which is, it's happening. It's very, very difficult and very challenging for the people who are experiencing it, and so I wouldn't want to minimize that. But we know what it is, and it's not affecting the overwhelming majority of the F-1 population. So again, we're talking about what right now is a group that's a little bit over 1,000 of a much larger, which is a very tiny portion of a much larger group that is over 1 million. And the two issues are criminal justice involvement and participation in campus protests. So if those don't apply to you, from what we've seen so far, then that's not an issue. And even if they do apply to you, again, there are things you can do to sort of prepare to respond if there is a termination. And also if you were involved in campus activism, to be prepared with the assistance of counsel to articulate that you are not advocating nor intending to advocate any kind of support for a terrorist organization. Because that's really the main thing that they're sort of focusing on, are statements that they are interpreting as support for quote endorsement or support of a terrorist organization. And so, and also be mindful of the broader legal challenges that are going on, because there are arguments being made by attorneys that, these amount to infringements on freedom of speech. This is going to play out in the courts in the next few months. But that population, by the way, is a very, very tiny population. Again, even that gets a lot of drama in the media, we're really talking about a really pretty small group of people who are affected, are having their student status affected by it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think just to emphasize what you said is absolutely not minimizing the difficulties that this would be for going through it. But the good thing is that it is a small percentage and that there are solutions like seeking legal counsel. There's a lot of energy of people, rallying behind trying to fight this and figuring out what the best path are. So I think that's something that you weren't quite sure what to expect with the new administration, and now we're starting to learn, and now we can kind of act accordingly, and applicants can have that in mind when they're getting ready for their process.
So, Davis, I'm seeing a lot of what seem to me pretty individual questions in the chat, so I'm going to be hesitant to directly answer those. There is one question I've noted, though, that I think is an interesting one, which is, will this activity, whether it's revocations and deportations, affect new F-1 visas?
I had flagged the same question, so I'll put it on the screen for everybody to see.
And I think that is an important question, because I think with respect to first-time F-1s, the environment is also different for them. And among the things that are happening, and among the things, by the way, that are leading to some of the sort of protest-related record terminations and visa revocations, is social media use. And so the State Department, as well as the Department of Homeland Security, are engaged in, again, something that's been going on all along, but they are doing more of it, in scanning people's social media and looking for content in their social media that is perceived to be consistent with support of terrorism, or that is seen as having adverse policy consequences in terms of the United States foreign relations with other countries. So that is something to be mindful of as you are applying, because that is something that could lead to either more questions during your visa application process, or in fact potentially could lead to denials in the first instance.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and we're hearing more about the social media, that's going to be more of an element that officers are looking into. And as you may or may not know, that is something asked in the DS-160, that you need to put your social media handles there. And that's something that, even knowing that the officers are going to look at it, you need to be truthful and put your real social media on there, because the consequences, if you don't, could be greater. So just keep in mind kind of what you're posting and what's out there online about your accounts and social media activity.
Yeah, and what I would add, by the way, about that is that if you have had social media activity that is about the topics we're talking about here, you want to talk to counsel, and you want to think about how you're going to address that if you're asked about it during the course of a visa interview. Because a lot of this will depend on how a consular officer, and there's really, if a consular officer says no to your visa, there's really not much of anywhere to go generally.
Yeah.
And so, having the best possible answer for that interview is important. So that's something also to just be thinking about if if there is this kind of content on your if there has ever been, by the way. Because the fact that you deleted your content doesn't mean that it's still not discoverable to the government. And one big example that some of you may be aware of, there was a physician actually who was arriving in Boston a few weeks ago, who had content in her deleted photos that was seen by a customs officer when she was entering the United States. And that content was used as basis to deport her. So the fact that you've deleted something doesn't necessarily mean that it's gone. And so you do need to be prepared to address anything that has ever been, that they might get interested in, that has ever been in your, on your social media, on your phone, because these are things that can come up during the process.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. If you, when in doubt, contact a professional, be on kind of the cautious side. And just as you had another question about the interview process, I think we kind of touched on that as well. And as you probably know, that here at Argo, we focus a lot on the visa interview process. And if you do leave the U.S. after having a CVIS termination, you're going to have to go for another visa interview and be really prepared for how you're going to communicate to the visa officer and go about that interview process. So another thing is we don't exactly know the long-term culture impact at the visa interview yet. The State Department, as you guys may or may not know, does release the visa statistics. We just got the statistics from last year, which was that about 41% of students were refused. So that number has been steadily increasing year over year over the past 3-4 years. So we're not sure how this new culture or what's in the media will impact kind of the rates this year. But just to keep in mind that even last year it was at 41%. So just being very prepared for how you're going to speak to the officer, explain your case, especially if you have any reason for concern. Always rather be safe than sorry, as sometimes it can be hard to get a second interview, all those challenges. So we are wrapping up on time. Do you have anything else that you would like to kind of close with? Any parting words for students that are either in the U.S. already or that are thinking about or that will be going to an interview this summer?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is to, preparation is huge for and being careful about compliance is huge. So, one, I think you've articulated that really well, Dave, as far as, the importance of preparation for the interviews and thinking through issues that might come up. I think as you go through your overall F-1 journey, I think there's a defined set of things that you need to think about, about fees that you need to pay, about maintaining your enrollment, about following the rules with respect to your employment. Those are sort of the basics that people need to think about. And then, I would never want to discourage people from expressing their political opinions, but that does need to be done in the case of F-1 students with some consciousness of the way that sort of activity is now being viewed by the federal government. And similarly, if there is criminal justice involvement, it is important to think about that in terms of how it may affect your status long term, and to get advice of counsel about how you resolve the case, about steps you can take perhaps to get that case what's called expunged, so it's sealed so that nobody knows about it. Those are all things that you need to pay attention to, especially given what is heightened scrutiny right now of student visa holders.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, I do need to return to the fact this is really, at the end of the day, affecting a very small number of student visa holders.
Mm-hmm. It all makes sense. And thank you so much for sharing your information and insights to give some more kind of explanation to what's out there in the news and illustrating kind of what is going on behind the scenes, how it impacts students, all of those things. So we really appreciate you for being here. For all of our audience members that are here, thank you very much for joining. As you guys hopefully know, we have more events throughout the week, so be sure to stay tuned, talking more about the interview itself, but we're really grateful for Mr. Leon Rodriguez for being here today, sharing his insights and expertise with us all. And we hope everybody has a great rest of your day, and good luck to you all in your student visa applications this summer. Thank you.
Thank you.